Greetings all, Jeff Forster here. I am back doing the Clay Houston social media takeover, and today I'm going to show you how I have been recycling solid blocks of clay. So in my studio and in the studio at Glassell, I often find these blocks of clay that have sat for too long, and they're stiff leather hard, or even beyond that, to the point where there's no way you're going to wedge it, much less do anything else with it. And I began actually just firing the entire blocks, and I used them as paving stones and built a retaining wall along my driveway. But once I was finished with that, I started trying to come up with more creative ways to reutilize the clay instead of just putting it into the reclaim bin. And so I'm going to do an expedited demonstration about how I turn a solid block of clay into what I refer to as my geologic jars or geologic boxes. And so I'm just going to start by using my trusty wire tool and faceting this, giving it some really crag-like surfaces and things that kind of mimic or reference to me textures I see when I'm up close and personal rock climbing and really observing the textures and patterns that appear in rock. So obviously most of you know there are any number of tools you could use to do your facets, and that each of those will leave a slightly different texture or pattern. The wire still is one of my favorites though, and I've used old barbed wire and different types of wires. I've got a whole assortment of old kitchen knives that I frequently will use when I'm faceting. Make a lot of T-balls and facet those, as most of you are probably aware. But I came to clay because of its organic qualities, and so often trying to retain those qualities in finished pieces. I think even some of my installation work and other sculptural objects that reference industry and kind of decaying industry or abandoned objects, I think even those, if you look at them closely, you can see the natural qualities of the clay still. And of course I'm using high iron clays in those and retaining that iron quality to reference decaying machinery and other materials. So I usually go around, just facet each side, taking as little off as possible. I might see parts like in the corner down here, there's some of the texture from the bag still down there. Sometimes I'll leave things like that if it's appealing to me. And then I might come in up from the bottom, give this a little bit of an undercut. So kind of the same principle as trimming a foot on a pot, right? If you bevel undercut that pot so there's a negative space, it just gives the pot a little lift. So similar principle here. I'll actually come in with my knife down here. It doesn't have to be excessive, but generally speaking, it appeals to me more if it has that little lift to it. And then I often tell my students it's a good idea to step away from your piece, look at it from all sides. Right now, it's got a little bit of a lean this way that's not appealing to me. So I think I'm going to take off part of that top corner. So kind of sharing my thought process. So I find the best practice, and I need to let this set up some more anyhow, so often what I find is when I carve these solid blocks is that the outside surface is generally stiffer than the inside, right? That makes sense. And so I'm using that to my advantage because I want to be able to handle this without messing up the texture I just put on the outside, but I also need to carve out the inside, right? So I'm going to let this thing breathe for at least several hours. Kind of just depends on what the atmosphere is going to do in the room. And then eventually I'm going to come back and I want to be able to take these things apart and hollow them out. And I think I'm going to go ahead and cut here. So that way when these two things come apart, they really only go back together one way, right? So the lid has like a cradle it sits in the bottom. They're built into each other. So I'm just going to let this thing set up, and to revert back to what I was saying earlier before I got sidetracked, was always a good idea, at least for me, to come back and revisit the shape. Maybe sit on it for a couple hours, come back and look again and see if I see something that maybe I'm missing now. So that said, I will see you later. Alright, so I'm back here in my makeshift studio during quarantine, and I've let this set up overnight and let this outside surface get to a pretty stiff point where I feel like I can handle it now without destroying any texture. So the next step, of course, is to hollow this thing out. And so I'm just going to take, and typically what I do is use a tool that's just to kind of etch where I want the rim to be, or flange, or what have you. And I'm very generous with the amount of space I'm going to leave. So I'm actually, it's probably 3/4 inch or so that I'm leaving for the flange to rest on the bottom part here. And then with any number of loop tools, I'm just going to go ahead and remove that extra clay out of the inside. And I'm leaving this extra width so that I can come back in once this is hollowed out and really compress the clay from the inside out. And when I do that, I'm going to be really careful to have support on this outside wall, right? Because I don't want to be compressing clay on the inside and stressing the outside simultaneously. So I'm going to go ahead and hollow this out. Okay, so you can see I used the back end of the wooden knife to do my compressing on the inside after I hollowed it out. And then I came back just with my fingers, and I was mostly just making sure there wasn't any sharp edges left over or blemishes, but I was also simultaneously compressing with my fingers during that process. And then the last step, or one of the last steps I usually do, is during that compressing, you can see if I'm pulling clay up, a lot of times it kind of messes up this rim here. And so I like to just take a sharp knife, X-Acto, or a fettling knife even would work, and just bevel that edge. I'm going to clean it up a little bit, but also beveling, right? So functional potters in the group probably know that you don't want to have a crisp corner that's more prone to chipping or cracking, and particularly in something that gets heavy use like a lid going on and off of a pot or the rim of a mug going in and out of a dishwasher or sink. So generally speaking, those things are a little bit more durable if they're slightly rounded or beveled. So another thing that I did during that portion of the video that was sped up was that I was pinching the walls just to get a sense of how thick or thin they were, trying to keep a relatively consistent thickness just to help eliminate the probability of cracking issues. And then I'm just going to very gently, the flat side of this blade, come across the top of this flange or seat. There's a sharp corner right there I'm going to knock off. You can probably hear my dog panting in the background. Studio mate. She takes this very seriously. Alright, so from this point, I'm going to put this back together. Set that in there. There's really only one way that it fits. And then from here, I like to go around and I might just tap on the seam. Make sure that's lining. Once I've got the seam lined up the way I want it, there's typically not a lot of cleanup, particularly if the stage of the clay is a stiff leather hard. But if I did pick up textures or other blemishes while working on it, my favorite tool to use is a metal rib just to kind of scrape and erase those off of the surface. Of course, I'm being careful while doing that not to eliminate any textures that I actually want to keep. So there you have it. If you enjoyed this demo, actually, I started a YouTube channel for posting demos for students. It is called Simply Everything Clay for the time being. Trying to come up with something more clever than that, but if interested, go ahead and check it out. And I hope you have an awesome day. Thanks. Bye.